Hello, this is Miranda Schultz again. Now I'm doing our discussion board for week 7, and it talks about brain breaks. I already read the article, which was pretty fascinating about the teenage brain. I even shared it with my 8th grade team because I feel like a lot of that drama and stuff is happening currently towards the end of the school year. So it's pretty nice to remember that sometimes these students can't help the way that their brains are and their impulsivity. So that's a pretty cool article to read. Then you asked us to talk about brain break ideas. As I mentioned in previous discussion posts, I did create a PowerPoint basically that has brain based activities. I can show you that real quick. But it looks like I actually used one today. Just type it in here brain based. There they are. Okay. And so I created this so that I can have it up at all times so that if my students do need a break, I can just go click on one and it'll pop up. So I created it basically just having the name on it and then like a little blurb about what it might be so that I can explain it to my students really quickly just in case I forget. For some reason, it's taking a while to load. But anyway, it looks like this. And then the first slide, it's going to take a while. The first slide kind of just explains why it's important that we move while we're learning. And it's all stuff that I learned in this class. And then as I go down, you see the different types of brain activities that we did. Well, one of the ones that I tried this past week in my classroom was, where's it at? It's called mind mapping. Oh, there it is. Mind mapping. And so what I did was I first had my students, we've been doing the DRA, developmental reading assessment, this week in English class to get that out of the way before our map testing to see where they're actually at on reading levels. So they spend the first part of my class being real quiet, just letting the other students get through their DRAs. And then halfway through the class, I stopped it and I said, okay, let's do a brain activity because I knew they'd been sitting there independently reading the class book called Out of My Mind. And so I wanted them to get up and move around so that they weren't getting bored or falling asleep. Some of my students with ADHD were sitting there. I could see that they were starting to space off or get restless. So that was the time that I found that this would be necessary. So I went ahead and pulled this up, and it's the mind mapping activity that I learned in one of the books that we read, or I might have found it in an article. I can't remember now. We read so much, which is a good thing. But anyway, what happens is I put posters around my entire room, and those posters I had one that said character so far, one that said setting so far, one that said popping themes or messages that have came out and out of my mind, internal conflict so far, external conflict so far, interesting facts learned, predictions for what's to come. So I had 6 papers posted around the room. Some were on my wall, some were on my door, one was on my desk. And so they first all had to start off at one of those posters, and they had to have a marker. And so then when I told them was I explained every single paper and what all of them had and what all of them meant just to refresh their memory. We'd already learned about these topics previously in the year. So they knew what an external conflict was, internal conflict, but I just refreshed their memory on that. And then what they had to do was when I say go, they would have to write down as many external or, wherever they're at, whichever poster they're by, they would have to fill that out and then put their initials at the end of it. And then when I said stop, they would have to stop and then they'd have to scramble to go find another poster in the room and stand by that one. When I said go, they would hurry up and write down. And so they had to do that around the room. So they were actively moving around and they were trying to think up things that they had learned in Out of My Mind, the book that they're reading, and put those on there. So it was still content based, but they were getting to move around and it was kind of a fun activity. I had a small prize of like a toothbrush and deodorant at the end, just some silly prizes so that when the person who wrote the most on all the papers got one of the prizes, and then a person who had the best answers on all of them got a prize. I always like to do 2 different ones because I know that I have slower processing students, so it's not always okay to say that, okay, the person who has the most wins, because it's usually the same person every time. So I didn't want to do that this time around. So that was one I did this past week, and the kids really loved it and enjoyed it. And then the other day, I did this one called Act It Out. I was also working on DRAs last week, so it was on Thursday. And I decided to do Act It Out. So again, we were reading for the first part. Second part, I said, let's go ahead and do a brain break. And so we did the Act It Out where they all grabbed a partner and then they had to come up with a scene from the book, and they had to present that scene to the class, kind of like a little skit. So I gave them about 5 to 8 minutes to come up with a small skit. So they could use dialogue from the book, however they wanted to do it, and every group did it a little bit differently. So I went ahead and did that, and then they enjoyed it, and they were clapping and doing those things. So that brain break was very effective too, and again, content based. So it was cool. They were learning and being able to be active and involved. Sorry, that was my dog. Also, let's go back to those questions. Do you think brain breaks work? Yes, I do think they're very effective, especially those two examples I just shared with you. The kids were engaged. They actually like them, and they request to have brain breaks. I do think that I get more out of them when they're doing things like that, and I can tell that they're learning. I do think it's effective. What do you think the premise is behind using brain breaks? I think the premise is making sure that kids are still active, that they enjoy what they're doing, that they get their brains moving around, so that they can retain the information a lot more and put it into their memory. Do you think breaks have to involve movement, or are there ways to effectively implement them? Other ways to effectively implement. I like to think that brain breaks, at least for me in the special education classroom, need to have some type of involvement. The only time I could see it being one that wouldn't need involvement would be if you were doing something already active quite a bit. So, say you're like in a PE class where you're always moving, always moving. I feel like a brain break in PE might be one of those more meditation types of brain breaks where you would sit down, reflect, play a little of that guitar soothing music. That would be, I think, a brain break in something that's more active. And I think that would still be more effective because they're sitting there, they get that think time that we talked about in previous lessons. What part of the brain is activated when brain breaks are combined with movement? I believe that was the frontal lobe, correct? I think it's the frontal lobe because I think that that does involve a lot of your higher level thinking. And in the brain breaks that I do, if you're doing the meditating one, then you're obviously sitting in, soaking in everything that you've learned. So you have to have a higher level of thinking, of processing all that information. And then the ones where you're moving around, you really have to think deeply to get that out of your brain, um, to do that recall method. And I think that's all I had to answer for this assignment. So that's my discussion for week 7 and 8. A couple other questions that are on here say, how do you think this affects brain functioning? I kind of already hit on that. How do you think this affects brain health and health development? Again, I think your brain needs this to be healthy. It needs to move around. As we've discussed before, it helps recreate some of those brain cells or create new brain cells to help with learning. Do you feel if the body is bombarded with chemicals, unhealthy food, additives, it can affect the brain? Definitely. I think that your brain needs a certain amount of nutrients that is going to help your brain think and open up. And if you eat unhealthy foods, that's not going to allow for that to happen. I also know myself, and when I eat unhealthy foods, I almost feel more tired and things like that. So if I feel like every brain kind of needs the more nutritious side of things so they don't get tired and can retain things a lot more. What do you feel is the worst offender? I don't know. I would say lack of sleep and not being able to reach that DOK level. I think that would be the worst offender to the brain. Do you think any of this has played a role in the neonatal development, delays and disorders? Oh, yes, definitely. If this so-called food epidemic has been slowly progressing over the years, how do you think this has affected human development, processing, brain, and functioning? I think it's impacted it a lot, just kind of like I mentioned before. The more unhealthy unhealthy the food is, I think your brain is not getting that nutrients that it needs. If you feel there has been little impact to the environment, animals and people, plants, etc., please explain. I think that's had a huge impact, so I will not comment on that. All right. Thank you.